Y2K is a horror comedy about technology turning evil at the turn of the century. It's got a few laughs, but it might also make you cringe. Let's talk about it. In this movie, we follow Eli, played by Jaden Martell. He and his friend Danny go to a high school party on New Year's Eve in 1999 in hopes of getting lucky with girls, but once the clock hits midnight, all technology comes to life and starts slaying people. This forces Eli, his crush Laura, and a couple other kids on a misadventure to find safety and perhaps a long-term solution. This premise is built on the actual Y2K concern in 1999, where people were expecting a myriad of problems to occur with computers, but everything was fine. This movie takes that theory and turns it into a horror comedy by turning all of the technology into a hive mind that wants to kill people. Despite being a horror comedy, in its heart, it's a movie about being seen. We follow a couple dorky kids that struggle with being picked on by other cliquey kids and striking out with the ladies. It's pretty cliche with the angles it takes on being a coming-of-age story, but the movie is also a blast to the past in a couple of ways. There's all the 90s nostalgia sprinkled throughout the movie, you know, all the cultural references, the slang terms, and the 90s paraphernalia. But also the form this movie takes is greatly influenced by 90s and 2000s stoner comedies, as well as raunchy coming-of-age stories. It's a movie that's supposed to be stupid. It's not a movie that you bring your brain to. And for the first act, I was actually kind of digging it. I knew what I was getting myself into, and even though there were some red flags, I did get a few laughs out of it. But some of the humor was kind of cringy, and sometimes the movie feels like it's relying solely on swear words and unimaginative insults to be funny. There were a handful of jokes that I did laugh at, mostly in the first half of the movie. It would be unfair to say that the movie isn't funny at all. But once we jumped into the second act, things started to go south. Not only did the movie become substantially less funny, but it also just didn't seem to know what kind of movie it wanted to be. When the movie is trying too hard to be funny, it's often leaning into dated, cheesy humor, reflective of the type of humor you'd see in movies like Wayne's World or American Pie. The movie leans so hard into stupid territory that when it, like a light switch, tries to flip over into being serious, the contrast is just very jarring. It probably wouldn't be as mentionable if it just happened once or twice, but the movie flip-flops between being really silly and really serious so much that it just seems tone-deaf. When it jumps from serious to silly, it kind of works because those tense moments are abruptly cut short for comedic value, though that starts to get pretty predictable and old. The tonal shifts from silly to serious stopped working after, like, the second time. They would be less jarring and more appreciable if the humor wasn't so animated. But it's so cheesy that it's hard to see the movie as anything other than campy, so when it repeatedly tries to then be dark and emotional, it's just hard to think anything other than, oh, okay, so you want me to now take this movie seriously when kids were just getting murked by Tamagotchis and flying VHS tapes. The second act of this movie felt pretty short and empty just because there really wasn't much going on other than the occasional edgy banter between our characters. Similar to the movie's tonal issues is its lack of consistency with its characters. They will, at the drop of a dime, flip from being cool with each other to insulting them and back and forth a few more times. It didn't feel like the relationships were complicated. It felt like the writers just didn't have a clear idea of how they wanted the characters to feel about each other. The characters that make up the squad that we follow is probably not the ensemble that you were expecting when the clock hit midnight. They dropped a couple characters early on who I would have liked to have seen longer, and dare I say, one character who I think most of you will agree could have made the rest of the movie a lot more entertaining. The squad does kind of make sense though if you are thinking about the movie's core subject. It's a group of characters who can relate on some level, and then also Laura just because she's Eli's love interest. The cast overall was fine. There are some good casting choices and some bad casting choices. If I had to choose just one actor to be replaced in this movie, I would actually choose writer-director Kyle Mooney himself. He plays a stoner video store clerk, and he single-handedly pulls the movie from campy territory to extremely campy territory. I loved Kyle Mooney on SNL because when he plays a character, it's often conceptually funny that Kyle is the one playing that character. It works for that type of show. But this is not an SNL sketch, it's a movie, and it has an otherwise convincing cast where actors are playing characters that they have some right playing, but Kyle Mooney is not, making his presence feel that much more out of place. I wish I could say that he at least did a good job directing this movie, but it just feels really sloppy across the board. Some of the VFX are obviously supposed to be kind of subpar for comedic value, but the lack of choreography coupled with the fast cuts and editing made those action scenes feel really amateurish and not really in a funny or entertaining way. I am genuinely surprised that A24 picked up this movie. They did fund it, rather than like picking it up at a festival, so they couldn't see the finished product first. But I'm genuinely surprised that they read the script, saw who would be making the movie, and thought, yeah, that fits our brand. The movie has some funny moments and some crowd-pleasing nostalgia, but it just feels campy and tone-deaf overall. I'd say this movie was pretty lacking overall. It might be better to stream at home with some drinks, but it's not worth going to the theater for, especially when there are a lot of good movies playing this season. Thank you for watching this review. If it brought you any value at all, please give it a like. It really does help the channel grow. I'll see you next week with my review of Kraven the Hunter.